I flew 8,000 miles from Cape Town to watch my son get married, only to find myself seated behind the garbage bins like I was some kind of embarrassment he needed to hide. As I sat there in my best dress, watching him exchange vows while the smell of rotting food drifted over me, I smiled and clapped because what he didn't know was that by tomorrow morning his perfect wedding would become his worst nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where this all began, 3 months before that humiliating day that would change our relationship forever. My name is Lucinda Porter, but everyone calls me Cindy. I'm 57 years old, and I've spent the last 32 years of my life raising my son Marcus in a small coastal town outside Cape Town, South Africa. The ocean breeze was my constant companion through sleepless nights when he was a colicky baby, through his teenage years when he came home with scraped knees and broken hearts, and through the quiet years after he moved to Seattle for his job in tech. My husband David died when Marcus was only 15, leaving me to navigate the treacherous waters of single motherhood while working as a seamstress to keep us afloat. Those were the hardest years of my life, but also the most meaningful. Every stitch I sewed, every late night I spent hunched over my machine, every rand I saved was for Marcus. I wanted him to have opportunities I never had, to see the world beyond our little corner of South Africa. When Marcus called me that crisp autumn morning in March, his voice crackling through the international connection, I could hear something different in his tone. There was an excitement there that I hadn't heard since he was a boy, showing me a drawing he'd made at school. "Mom," he said, and I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. "I have news." I set down my cup of rooibos tea and settled into my favorite chair by the window, the one that looked out over the garden David had planted before he died. "Tell me everything, my boy." "I'm getting married." The words tumbled out so fast I almost missed them. "Her name is Madison, and Mom, she's incredible. We've been together for 2 years, and I know this is right. I know Dad would have loved her." My heart swelled with joy even as a small part of me felt the familiar pang of being so far away from my son's life. 2 years, and this was the first I was hearing about Madison. But I pushed that feeling down because this was Marcus's moment, and I was determined to be nothing but happy for him. "Oh, Marcus," I breathed, pressing my hand to my chest. "That's wonderful news, sweetheart. Tell me about her. What's she like?" For the next hour, he painted a picture of Madison Clark, a marketing executive from a prominent Seattle family. She was 28, had graduated from Stanford, and according to Marcus had a laugh that could light up a room. Her father owned a chain of luxury hotels across the Pacific Northwest, and her mother was involved in every charity organization worth mentioning in Seattle society. "The wedding is going to be at the Fairmont Olympic," Marcus said, and I could hear the pride in his voice. "Madison's family has connections there. It's going to be beautiful, Mom. Really elegant." I nodded even though he couldn't see me, already imagining the grandeur of it all. The Fairmont Olympic was the kind of place I'd only seen in magazines, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers. "When is the wedding, love?" "June 15th. I know it's short notice, but Madison's family had a cancellation at their venue, and we couldn't pass up the opportunity. You'll come, won't you?" "I mean, I know it's expensive, but I can help with the ticket if you need." "Marcus," I interrupted gently, "nothing would keep me away. Nothing. This is your wedding day. I'll be there." After we hung up, I sat in that chair for a long time, watching the sun set over Table Mountain in the distance. My little boy was getting married. The child I'd rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, who'd cried in my arms when the bullies at school called him names, who'd held my hand at his father's funeral with a courage that broke my heart. He was starting his own family. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. I took on extra work, staying up late into the night to finish rush orders so I could afford not just the plane ticket, but a dress worthy of such an elegant occasion. I found a beautiful navy blue dress with delicate lace sleeves at a boutique in Cape Town. It was more than I'd ever spent on a single piece of clothing, but this was my son's wedding. I wanted to look like the proud mother I was. I spent weeks researching Seattle, learning about the city that had become Marcus's home. I looked up the Fairmont Olympic online, marveling at the photos of its grand ballroom and ornate details. I imagined myself walking into that beautiful space, seeing my son in his tuxedo, meeting the woman who had captured his heart. The phone calls between Marcus and me became more frequent as the wedding approached. He told me about the menu they'd chosen, the flowers Madison had selected, the band they'd hired. Everything sounded perfect, magical even. But there was something in his voice during those calls that I couldn't quite place. A hesitation, maybe, or a carefulness that hadn't been there before. When I asked about meeting Madison, Marcus always seemed to have a reason why it hadn't happened yet. She was traveling for work, or they were busy with wedding planning, or the time difference made it difficult. I understood, of course. Planning a wedding was stressful, and I didn't want to add to their burden. 2 weeks before the wedding, Marcus called with the flight details. He'd booked my ticket, and I was grateful because the cost would have been nearly 3 months of my income. But when he told me about the hotel arrangements, something felt off. "I've got you set up at a lovely little bed and breakfast about 20 minutes from the venue," he said. "It's really charming, Mom." "Very quaint." "Oh," I said, trying to hide my disappointment. I'd assumed I'd be staying at the same hotel as the wedding, maybe even the Fairmont itself. "That sounds nice, sweetheart." "Madison's family has pretty much taken over the Fairmont for the weekend," he explained quickly. "All their relatives and friends are staying there, and you know how these big families can be? It gets a bit overwhelming." I nodded, pushing down the small hurt that was forming in my chest. Of course Madison's family would want to be together. I was just one person, and they were a whole clan. It made sense. But as the departure date approached, more little things began to add up. When I asked about the rehearsal dinner, Marcus mentioned it was a small, intimate affair. Just immediate family. When I asked about meeting Madison's parents before the ceremony, he said they'd be very busy with last-minute preparations. When I suggested we have dinner the night I arrived, he said he and Madison had appointments with the wedding planner that couldn't be moved. Each explanation made perfect sense on its own, but together they painted a picture that made my stomach twist with unease. I told myself I was being silly, that I was reading too much into things because I was nervous about the trip and meeting Madison's family for the first time. The night before my flight, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my small house, touching the framed photos of Marcus that lined the mantelpiece. There he was at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning after losing his first tooth. At 10, proudly holding up a fish he'd caught on one of our rare trips to the coast. At 18, in his school uniform on graduation day, trying to look serious but unable to hide his excitement about university. In every photo, it was just the two of us. After David died, we'd become a team. Marcus and me against the world. We'd weathered every storm together, celebrated every victory as a pair. And now he was starting his own family, which was exactly what I'd always wanted for him. So why did I feel like I was losing him?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I shook off the melancholy and focused on the positive. In less than 24 hours, I'd be on a plane to Seattle. I'd see my son get married. I'd meet the woman who made him happy. I'd be part of one of the most important days of his life. The flight from Cape Town to Seattle was long and exhausting, with 2 connections and nearly 20 hours of travel time. I'd never been on a plane for more than a few hours, and by the time I stumbled off the final flight at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, I felt like I had been turned inside out. But the moment I saw Marcus waiting for me at the gate, all the fatigue melted away. He looked so grown up in his crisp, button-down shirt and dark jeans, his hair neatly styled. When he hugged me, I breathed in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something else. Nervousness, maybe. "Mom," he said, pulling back to look at me. "You made it. How was the flight?" "Long," I laughed, smoothing down my travel-wrinkled blouse. "But worth every minute to be here with you." As we walked toward baggage claim, I kept expecting him to mention Madison, to say she was waiting in the car, or that we'd be meeting her for dinner. But he was quiet, focused on navigating the busy airport and getting my suitcase. "Is Madison excited about tomorrow?" I asked as we waited for my bag to appear on the carousel. "Yeah, of course," Marcus said, but he didn't look at me when he answered. "She's just really busy with final preparations. You know how brides get. I didn't, actually. I'd never had a big wedding myself. David and I had eloped to a small chapel in Stellenbosch with just 2 witnesses. But I nodded anyway, not wanting to seem ignorant about these things. The drive to the bed and breakfast was quiet. Marcus pointed out a few landmarks as we drove through the city, but there was a tension in the car that I couldn't ignore. When we pulled up to a small, slightly run-down Victorian house with a hand-painted sign that read Rose Garden Inn, my heart sank a little. It was clean and probably perfectly comfortable, but it was a far cry from the luxury I'd imagined surrounding my son's wedding weekend. "This looks lovely," I lied, not wanting Marcus to see my disappointment. He helped me carry my suitcase to the front door, where a pleasant older woman named Mrs. Henderson checked me in. The room was small but tidy, with floral wallpaper and a view of the parking lot. "I should probably head back," Marcus said, hovering in the doorway. "Madison and I have a meeting with the florist in an hour, and then dinner with her parents." "Of course," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "Will I see you before the ceremony tomorrow?" "The wedding starts at 4, he said. "I'll have someone pick you up around 3:30. And Mom?" He paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Thank you for coming all this way. It means everything to me." After he left, I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared out the window at the gray Seattle sky. The jet lag was hitting me hard, but it was more than that. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my son was pulling away from me just when I'd traveled so far to be close to him. I spent the evening exploring the neighborhood around the bed and breakfast, trying to work off my restless energy. I found a small cafe where I had a bowl of soup and called my friend Helen back in Cape Town to let her know I'd arrived safely. "How's Marcus?" she asked. "Is he nervous about the big day?" "He seems a bit stressed," I said, stirring my soup absently. "But I suppose that's normal." "And what about the bride? What's she like?" I paused, realizing I still couldn't answer that question. "I haven't met her yet. Tomorrow, I suppose." There was a long silence on Helen's end. Finally, she said gently, "Cindy, you've been there for hours. Isn't it a bit odd that you haven't met her yet?" I didn't have an answer for that, and after we hung up, Helen's words echoed in my mind. It was odd. If my son was marrying someone I'd never met, wouldn't the first thing be introductions? Wouldn't Madison want to meet the woman who'd raised the man she loved? That night, I lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the city outside my window. Tomorrow was my son's wedding day, and instead of feeling excited, I felt like an outsider looking in on someone else's life. When morning came, I tried to push away my doubts and focus on the joy of the occasion. I spent extra time getting ready, styling my hair, and applying my makeup carefully. The navy dress fit perfectly, and when I looked at myself in the small mirror, I saw a woman who was proud and dignified, ready to celebrate her son's happiness. At exactly 3:30, a taxi arrived to take me to the Fairmont Olympic. As we drove through downtown Seattle, I marveled at the city's beauty. The Space Needle gleamed in the distance, and Elliott Bay sparkled under the late afternoon sun. This was Marcus's home now, and I could see why he loved it. The Fairmont Olympic was even more magnificent than I'd imagined. The moment I stepped into the lobby, I was overwhelmed by the grandeur of it all. Crystal chandeliers hung from soaring ceilings, marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and elegantly dressed guests moved through the space like they belonged in a movie. I approached the concierge desk to ask about the wedding, and the young man there directed me toward the ballroom. As I walked through the hotel's corridors, I passed other wedding guests, women in designer dresses and men in expensive suits, all chatting and laughing as they made their way to the ceremony. When I reached the entrance to the ballroom, my breath caught in my throat. It was absolutely stunning. Hundreds of white roses and peonies adorned every surface, and soft candlelight created a romantic atmosphere that belonged in a fairy tale. The chairs were arranged in neat rows facing an altar that looked like something from a dream. But as I stood there taking it all in, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A young woman in a black dress with a clipboard was directing guests to their seats, and she kept looking at me with a puzzled expression. "Excuse me," she said, approaching me with a professional smile. "Are you here for the Clark Porter wedding?" "Yes," I said, straightening my shoulders. I'm Lucinda Porter, Marcus's mother. The smile faltered for just a moment, and she glanced down at her clipboard with what looked like panic. Oh, Mrs. Porter. Of course. I'm sorry. There seems to be some confusion about your seating assignment. Confusion? I asked, my heart beginning to race. If you could just wait here for one moment, she said, her voice tight with stress. I need to check with the wedding coordinator. I watched as she hurried away, clipboard clutched to her chest, and I felt the familiar sensation of being an inconvenience. Around me, other guests were being seated with ease. Madison's family and friends, I assumed, all of them belonging in this world of luxury and privilege, in a way that I clearly didn't. After what felt like an eternity, the woman returned with another woman, this one older and clearly in charge. They approached me together, and I could see them exchanging glances that made my skin crawl with embarrassment. Mrs. Porter, the older woman said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm Carol, the wedding coordinator. I'm so sorry for the confusion. We've had to make some last-minute adjustments to the seating arrangements. That's fine, I said, though nothing about this felt fine. If you could follow me, Carol said, I'll show you to your seat. I followed her through the ballroom, past row after row of perfectly dressed guests. We walked past the section where I assumed immediate family would sit, past the section for close friends, past what seemed like every decent seat in the house. We kept walking toward the back, and with each step my heart sank lower. Finally, we reached the very back of the ballroom, behind the last row of chairs, near a service entrance where the catering staff was quietly moving in and out. And there, tucked behind a decorative screen that barely concealed 2 large garbage bins filled with wedding preparation debris, was a single folding chair. Here we are, Carol said, brightly, as if she was showing me to a front row seat. This should give you a lovely view of the ceremony. I stared at the chair, then at the garbage bins, then back at Carol's expectant face. The smell of rotting flowers and food waste drifted over from the bins, and I could hear the clink of plates being cleared from the pre-ceremony reception. There must be some mistake, I said quietly. I'm the mother of the groom. Carol's smile tightened. I understand this isn't ideal, Mrs. Porter, but we've had some very last-minute RSVPs from Madison's family, and we've had to accommodate everyone as best we can. I'm sure you understand. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand how the mother of the groom ends up seated behind garbage bins while strangers get prime seats. But I also couldn't make a scene at my son's wedding, so I nodded and sat down in that folding chair, smoothing my beautiful dress over my knees and trying to hold on to what little dignity I had left. From my position behind the decorative screen, I could barely see the altar. I had to lean to one side and crane my neck just to catch glimpses of what was happening. The guests in the real seats chatted and laughed, completely unaware that the groom's mother was hidden away like a shameful secret. When the music started and the wedding party began their processional, I stood up and pressed myself against the screen, trying to see my son. There he was, looking handsome and nervous in his black tuxedo, standing at the altar waiting for his bride. My heart swelled with love and pride even as it broke with the humiliation of my situation. Then Madison appeared at the back of the aisle, and I understood immediately why I was hidden away. She was absolutely stunning, like something from a magazine cover. Her dress was a masterpiece of silk and lace that probably cost more than I made in a year. Her blonde hair was styled in an elegant updo, and her makeup was flawless. She moved down the aisle like she was floating, every step graceful and confident. But it wasn't her beauty that made everything click into place. It was the way she carried herself, the way the guests looked at her, with a reverence that spoke of social status and wealth. This was Madison's world, and I clearly didn't belong in it. As she reached Marcus and they began their vows, I found myself crying, not from joy, but from a pain so deep I didn't know how to name it. My son was marrying a woman from a different universe, and I was being hidden away because I was an embarrassment to their perfect picture. The ceremony was beautiful, even from my obstructed view behind the garbage bins. Marcus and Madison exchanged vows that spoke of forever and partnership, and when they kissed, the crowd erupted in applause. I clapped too, because despite everything, this was my son's moment of happiness. But as the guests began to file out for cocktails and photos, I remained in my chair, unsure of what to do next. Was I invited to the reception? Would there be another folding chair behind another screen? Or was this where my participation in my son's wedding ended? Carol appeared again, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Porter, if you'd like to stay for photos, we can arrange that. But you'll need to wait until after the immediate family and wedding party are finished." Immediate family. The words hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't immediate family anymore. Somehow, without my realizing it, I'd been demoted to extended family, or worse, an obligation to be managed rather than a person to be celebrated. "That's all right," I said, standing up and smoothing my dress one more time. "I think I'll head back to my hotel." Carol looked relieved. "Of course. I hope you enjoyed the ceremony." I walked out of that ballroom with my head held high, even though inside I was crumbling. In the lobby, I passed groups of wedding guests heading to the cocktail hour, all of them laughing and celebrating. None of them knew who I was, and clearly, that was exactly how Madison and Marcus wanted it. As I waited for a taxi outside the hotel, I pulled out my phone and looked at the photos I'd managed to take from my hidden position. They were blurry and poorly angled, but I could just make out Marcus's face as he said his vows. He looked happy, and that should have been enough for me. But it wasn't. Because in that moment, standing outside that beautiful hotel in my expensive dress, smelling the lingering scent of garbage from the bins I'd been seated behind, I realized that my relationship with my son had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the most important woman in his life, and apparently, I wasn't even important enough to be treated with basic dignity at his wedding. The taxi ride back to the bed and breakfast was quiet, and I spent it staring out the window at the city lights, trying to process what had just happened. I'd flown 8,000 miles to be humiliated at my own son's wedding. I'd spent money I didn't have to buy a dress that no one saw because I was hidden away like a dirty secret. But as we pulled up to the Rose Garden Inn, something inside me shifted. The hurt was still there, raw and painful, but underneath it was something else. Something harder and more determined. I sat in my small room that night, still wearing my beautiful dress, and I made a decision. If Marcus wanted to pretend I didn't exist, if he wanted to hide me away and treat me like an inconvenience, then perhaps it was time he learned what it really meant to lose me. I opened my laptop and began typing, my fingers moving with a purpose I hadn't felt in months. Because what Marcus didn't know was that his new wife wasn't the only one with connections. What he didn't know was that the quiet seamstress he'd hidden behind garbage bins had been keeping secrets of her own. And by tomorrow morning, his perfect new life was going to come crashing down around him. I woke up the next morning with a clarity that surprised me. The Seattle rain was pattering against the window of my small room at the Rose Garden Inn, and for the first time since arriving in this city, I felt like I knew exactly what I needed to do. My laptop was still open on the narrow desk where I'd left it the night before, the cursor blinking in the middle of an email I'd been composing. I'd written and deleted a dozen different messages, trying to find the right words for what I needed to say. But now, in the gray morning light, the words came easily. I pulled on my robe and made myself a cup of instant coffee with the little kettle in the room, then settled back at the desk. My fingers moved across the keyboard with purpose now, no hesitation, no second guessing. The email I was writing wasn't born from anger or spite, though both of those emotions were certainly present. It was born from something deeper, a need to reclaim my dignity and show my son that actions have consequences. The email was addressed to James Whitmore, the editor-in-chief of the Seattle Tribune, one of the most widely read newspapers in the Pacific Northwest. James and I had been corresponding for over 2 years now, ever since I'd reached out to him about a human interest story on single mothers in South Africa. What had started as a professional relationship had evolved into something resembling friendship, built on our shared appreciation for honest storytelling and social justice. James had no idea I was in Seattle. He had no idea my son lived here, or that I'd just endured the most humiliating experience of my life at what should have been one of the happiest days. But he was about to find out, because James specialized in exactly the kind of story I was about to give him. Dear James, I wrote, I hope this email finds you well. I'm writing to you from Seattle, where I've just witnessed something that I believe deserves public attention. Yesterday, I attended a wedding at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel that perfectly illustrates the kind of class discrimination and social prejudice that we've discussed in our previous conversations about inequality. I paused, taking a sip of my coffee and choosing my words carefully. This wasn't about revenge, I told myself. This was about justice. This was about holding people accountable for their actions. The wedding in question was that of Madison Clark, daughter of hotel magnate Richard Clark, to a young man whose mother was deliberately humiliated and hidden away during the ceremony. The mother, who had traveled internationally to attend her son's wedding, was seated behind garbage bins at the back of the ballroom, treated like an unwelcome intrusion rather than an honored guest. I went on to describe the events of the previous day in careful detail, painting a picture of the systematic exclusion and deliberation humiliation I'd experienced. I didn't mention that I was the mother in question, not yet. I presented it as a story I'd witnessed, a societal issue that deserved investigation. I believe this incident speaks to larger questions about how we treat people based on their economic status and social background. When families prioritize image over love, when social status becomes more important than basic human dignity, we all lose something essential about what it means to be community. I attached several photos I'd managed to take discreetly during the wedding. Shots of the opulent ballroom, the elaborate floral arrangements, and yes, a photo of the area where I'd been seated, complete with the garbage bins and the folding chair. I'd taken that last photo before leaving, somehow knowing I might need evidence of what had happened to me. After I sent the email, I sat back and stared out the window at the rainy Seattle morning. Part of me felt sick about what I'd just done. Marcus was my son, and I'd just potentially exposed him to public scrutiny. But the larger part of me felt something I hadn't felt since stepping off that plane. Power. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I wasn't a victim. I was someone taking action. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart jumped when I saw Marcus's name on the screen. For a wild moment, I thought he might be calling to apologize, to explain what had happened, to invite me to a belated celebration where I could finally meet Madison properly. Instead, the message read, "Mom, hope you enjoyed the wedding. Madison and I are leaving for our honeymoon this afternoon. Thanks for coming." That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of how I'd been treated, no invitation to say goodbye before they left for their honeymoon. Just a perfunctory thank you, like I was a distant relative who'd sent a wedding gift. I stared at the message for a long time, and with each passing second, I felt more certain that I'd made the right decision in contacting James. If Marcus could treat me like I was disposable, then perhaps it was time he learned that disposal works both ways. The response from James came faster than I'd expected, arriving in my inbox just 2 hours after I'd sent my initial email. His message was brief but intrigued. "Cindy, this is a fascinating story with exactly the kind of social implications we love to explore. Can we set up a call today? I'd like to discuss this further and potentially move forward with an investigation." We spoke for over an hour that afternoon, with me providing additional details about the wedding and the circumstances surrounding it. James was a skilled interviewer, asking probing questions that helped me articulate exactly why the experience had been so damaging. The issue isn't just that I was poorly seated, I explained to him over the phone. It's that deliberate choices were made to hide me, to minimize my presence, to make me feel unwelcome at my own son's wedding. It speaks to a broader pattern of how society treats people who don't fit into certain economic or social categories. James agreed, and by the end of our conversation, he'd committed to sending a reporter to interview me in person. The story would run in the Sunday edition of the Tribune, their most widely read issue, with additional coverage online. "We'll need to verify the details independently," James warned me. "We'll be reaching out to the hotel, the wedding planner, possibly even the bride and groom themselves for comment." "I understand," I said, though the thought of Marcus being contacted by a reporter made my stomach twist with a mixture of anticipation and dread. That evening, I sat in my small room and finally allowed myself to fully process what had happened at the wedding. I thought about the moment I'd realized I was being hidden away, the careful choreography that had gone into making sure I was invisible to the important guests. I thought about Madison's family, how they'd filled the front rows while I sat behind garbage bins. I thought about Marcus, standing at that altar in his perfect tuxedo, knowing exactly where his mother was seated and doing nothing to change it. The hurt was still there, raw and deep, but it was joined now by something else, a sense of purpose. For too many years, I'd accepted being minimized, being overlooked, being treated as less important than other people's comfort or convenience. But I was done with that now. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Helen, calling from Cape Town. "How was the wedding, love?" she asked, her voice warm with affection. "Was it everything you hoped it would be?" I found myself laughing, though there was no humor in the sound. "It was certainly memorable," I said. "Tell me everything. What was Madison like? Was she lovely? Did her family welcome you?" I paused, looking around my small room at the Rose Garden Inn, thinking about how to answer that question. "Helen," I said finally, "let me call you back in a few days. I have some things I need to take care of here first." After we hung up, I realized that I hadn't even begun to process how I was going to explain all of this to my friends back home. They'd been so excited for me, so happy that I was finally going to meet Marcus's bride and be part of his new life. How could I tell them that instead of being welcomed into a new family, I'd been treated like an embarrassment to be hidden away? The next morning brought another email from James, this one with more urgency. "Cindy, we've done some preliminary research, and this story is bigger than we initially thought. The Clark family has a history of exactly this kind of behavior at their social events. We found 3 other instances in the past 2 years where people were excluded or marginalized at Clark family functions based on their social status. This isn't an isolated incident, it's a pattern." My hands trembled slightly as I read his message. I'd thought this was just about my personal humiliation, but apparently, Madison's family had a reputation for this kind of treatment. I wasn't their first victim, just their most recent one. James's email continued. "We'd like to run this as a larger investigation into social discrimination in Seattle's elite circles, with your experience as the centerpiece. Are you comfortable with that level of exposure?" I thought about it for a long time before responding. Going public with this story would mean burning every bridge with Marcus, probably permanently. It would mean admitting to the world that my own son had allowed me to be humiliated at his wedding. It would mean facing whatever retaliation the Clark family might attempt. But it would also mean standing up for every other person who'd been made to feel small by people who thought their money and social status gave them the right to treat others as disposable. "Yes," I wrote back to James. "I'm ready." The reporter, a woman named Sarah Chen, arrived at the Rose Garden Inn that afternoon with a photographer and a recorder. Sarah was in her 30s, professionally dressed but with kind eyes that put me at ease immediately. "Mrs. Porter," she said as we settled into the small sitting area off the inn's lobby, "I want you to know that we take stories like this very seriously. What happened to you represents something much larger than just one wedding, and we want to make sure we tell it accurately and respectfully." For the next 3 hours, I walked Sarah through every detail of my experience. She asked thoughtful questions, taking notes and occasionally requesting clarification. The photographer, meanwhile, took pictures of me in my navy dress, the same one I'd worn to the wedding, and several shots of the modest surroundings of the inn where I'd been staying. "We've reached out to the Fairmont Olympic for comment," Sarah told me as our interview wound down. "They've confirmed that a wedding took place there on the date you specified, and that unusual seating arrangements were made at the request of the wedding party. They declined to comment further, citing client confidentiality." My heart raced at the implications of that statement. The hotel had essentially confirmed my story without meaning to. The unusual seating arrangements could only refer to my exile behind the garbage bins. "We've also attempted to reach Marcus Porter and Madison Clark Porter for comment," Sarah continued, and my stomach dropped. "So far, they haven't responded to our requests, but they have until tomorrow evening to provide a statement before we go to print." That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining Marcus's face when he received a call from a reporter asking for comment about his mother's treatment at his wedding. I pictured him scrambling to understand how this had become public, maybe even beginning to realize the magnitude of what had been done to me. Part of me hoped he would call, that hearing from a reporter would shock him into understanding how badly he'd hurt me. But my phone remained silent through the long Seattle night. The next morning brought a flurry of activity. James called to let me know that the story had been expanded to include interviews with 2 other people who'd been marginalized at Clark family events. One was a cousin who'd been excluded from family photos at a holiday party because her husband was deemed, quote, unsuitable. Another was a business associate who'd been seated at what was essentially a children's table at a company function because he didn't meet their social standards. This is becoming quite the exposé, James told me. The Clark family's behavior appears to be systematic and ongoing. Your story was the catalyst we needed to bring this pattern into the light. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and terror. I'd wanted justice, but I hadn't anticipated becoming the center of what was turning into a major news story. That afternoon, Sarah called with an update. "We've heard back from Marcus Porter," she said, and my heart stopped. He declined to comment, but his wife provided a brief statement through their attorney. "What did she say?" I managed to ask. Sarah's voice was carefully neutral as she read Madison's statement. "The seating arrangements at our wedding were carefully planned to accommodate all guests appropriately. Mrs. Porter was provided with seating that allowed her to view the ceremony. Any suggestion that she was treated inappropriately is unfortunate and inaccurate." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar sting of being gaslit and dismissed. Even faced with a newspaper investigation, Madison was doubling down on her version of events, making it sound like being seated behind garbage bins was somehow appropriate accommodation. "There's more," Sarah continued. "We've also heard from Richard Clark, Madison's father. His statement was more aggressive. He called our investigation a hit piece and threatened the legal action if we publish anything that he considers defamatory. The threat of legal action sent a chill through me, but it also strengthened my resolve. If they were resorting to intimidation tactics, it meant they knew exactly how bad their behavior looked in the light of public scrutiny." "Are you still planning to run the story?" I asked. "Absolutely," Sarah said firmly. "Their threats actually confirm that we're on to something important. People don't threaten legal action unless they're worried about what might come to light." That evening, I sat in my room and wrote a letter to Marcus that I knew I would never send. In it, I poured out all the hurt and confusion I'd been carrying since the wedding. I told him about the little boy I remembered, the one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and tell me he loved me more than all the stars in the sky. I asked him when that boy had been replaced by a man who could watch his mother be humiliated and do nothing to stop it. Writing the letter helped me process my emotions, even though I tore it up as soon as I was finished. Tomorrow the story would run, and there would be no going back. Whatever relationship Marcus and I had left would probably be destroyed, but maybe that relationship had been an illusion anyway. The morning of publication, I woke up before dawn and couldn't fall back asleep. I knew the story would be online first, probably before the physical newspaper hit the stands. I made coffee and sat with my laptop, refreshing the Tribune's website every few minutes until finally, there it was. The headline read, "Hidden in Plain Sight, How Seattle's Elite Use Weddings to Enforce Social Hierarchy." Below it was a photo of me in my navy dress, looking dignified despite everything I'd been through. Reading my own story in print was surreal. Sarah had done an excellent job of presenting the facts without sensationalizing them, letting the inherent injustice of the situation speak for itself. She'd woven in the other stories of Clark family exclusion, creating a picture of a family that consistently prioritized social status over basic human decency. The article included the hotel's confirmation of unusual seating arrangements, and quoted several event planning experts who called the described setup unprecedented and inappropriate for a family member of the wedding party. One expert was quoted as saying, "In 30 years of wedding planning, I have never heard of a groom's mother being seated behind service areas. It violates every standard of etiquette and basic respect." By noon, the story had been picked up by 3 other local news outlets and was trending on social media. The comment section was filled with people expressing outrage at my treatment and sharing their own stories of being marginalized at social events. My phone started ringing around 1 o'clock, but it wasn't Marcus calling. It was reporters from other news outlets, wanting to interview me for their own coverage of the story. I declined most of them, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden attention. But then Linda called from Cape Town, having seen the story online. "Cindy," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I had no idea it was that bad. Why didn't you tell me?" "I couldn't," I said honestly. "I was too hurt, too confused. I needed time to process it myself before I could explain it to anyone else." "Are you okay? I mean, really okay?" I thought about her question seriously before answering. "I think I am," I said. "For the first time since I got here, I feel like I have some control over the situation." That evening, as I was packing my things for my flight home the next day, my phone finally rang with the call I'd been both dreading and hoping for. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and my hands shook as I answered. "Mom." His voice was tight, controlled, furious. "What have you done?" "Hello, Marcus," I said calmly. "How was the honeymoon?" "Don't," he snapped. "Don't pretend this is a normal conversation. You destroyed my wedding. You made Madison's family look like monsters. You've humiliated us in front of the entire city." I felt a bubble of hysterical laughter rise in my throat. "I humiliated you?" "Yes," he said, his voice rising. "This newspaper story, these social media posts, people are calling Madison's father a snob and a bigot. Her mother is getting hate mail. All because you couldn't handle your seating arrangement." "My seating arrangement?" I repeated slowly. "Behind garbage bins. At my son's wedding." "You're being dramatic," Marcus said. But there was less conviction in his voice now. "It wasn't ideal, but you're making it sound like some kind of abuse." "Marcus," I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. "I flew 8,000 miles to watch you get married. I spent money I didn't have on a dress to look appropriate for your wedding. And you let them hide me away like I was something shameful, something that would embarrass you in front of your new family." "Madison's family has certain expectations," he said weakly. "There are social protocols. And those protocols were more important than treating your mother with basic dignity?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was smaller, less certain. "Mom, you don't understand how complicated this all is. Madison's family, they're not like us. They have standards, ways of doing things. I had to fit in. By making me invisible?" Another pause. "I didn't know they were going to seat you there. I thought you'd be in the back, but I didn't know about the bins." It was the first crack in his armor, the first admission that something had been wrong. But it wasn't enough. "And when you saw where I was sitting? When you saw me hidden away behind those bins during your ceremony? I was focused on the wedding. I didn't really notice." "You didn't notice that your mother was missing from your wedding photos? You didn't notice that I wasn't at the reception? You didn't think to check on me, or make sure I was included?" The silence stretched on so long, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Marcus said quietly, "I was trying to keep everyone happy. Everyone except me. Mom, please, can't we just move past this? The newspaper thing is done, the damage is caused. Can't we just try to repair our relationship?" I looked around my small room at the Rose Garden Inn, at the single suitcase that contained everything I'd brought to this city where my son lived, where he'd built a life that apparently had no real place for me. "Marcus," I said gently, "I would love nothing more than to repair our relationship, but that would require you to acknowledge that what happened was wrong, not just inconvenient or imperfect, but fundamentally wrong. It would require you to understand that I'm not a problem to be managed or hidden away. I'm your mother, and I deserve better than what you allowed to happen to me. But the newspaper story, The newspaper story exists because you and Madison's family thought you could treat me like garbage, and I would just accept it quietly. You thought I would smile and pretend everything was fine while you erased me from one of the most important days of your life. So this is revenge? I considered his question carefully. No, Marcus. This is accountability. This is what happens when you treat people badly and assume there will be no consequences. The conversation ended shortly after that, with no resolution, no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just Marcus hanging up, leaving me with the dial tone, and the certainty that our relationship might never recover from this. But as I finished packing and prepared for my journey home to Cape Town, I realized something important. I was okay with that possibility. For too long, I had accepted being minimized and overlooked because I was afraid of losing the relationship entirely. But I'd learned something crucial during my time in Seattle. A relationship built on my willingness to accept poor treatment wasn't really a relationship worth preserving. The next morning, as my taxi pulled away from the Rose Garden Inn and headed toward the airport, I looked back at the Seattle skyline one last time. Somewhere in this city, my son was probably trying to figure out how to repair his reputation and his marriage after the newspaper story. Somewhere in this city, Madison's family was probably planning their next move to minimize the damage to their social standing. But I was going home to Cape Town, to my small house by the ocean, to friends who valued me for who I was rather than what I could do for them. I was going home with my dignity intact and my voice finally heard. The plane rose above the clouds, carrying me away from Seattle and back to the life I'd built for myself. As the city disappeared below, I smiled and closed my eyes, finally ready to let go of the son I thought I knew and accept the man he'd chosen to become. 3 weeks after returning to Cape Town, I was sitting in my garden with my morning coffee when my phone rang with an international number I didn't recognize. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. I'd been screening calls ever since the Seattle Tribune story went viral, and reporters from around the world had been trying to reach me for follow-up interviews. But something made me answer this one. Mrs. Porter? The voice was American. Professional, but warm. This is attorney Rebecca Martinez from the law firm Martinez Wong and Associates in Seattle. I represent several clients who were mentioned in the recent Tribune article about discrimination at social events. I set down my coffee cup, my pulse quickening. I'm listening. Mrs. Porter, we've been following the response to your story, and we believe you may have grounds for a civil lawsuit against both the Clark family and the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. The deliberate segregation and humiliation you experienced, especially given the documented pattern of similar behavior, could constitute intentional infliction of emotional distress. The words hit me like a physical force, a lawsuit. I'd never considered that possibility, too focused on simply telling my story and reclaiming my dignity. I don't understand, I said slowly. What would a lawsuit accomplish? Rebecca's voice was gentle but firm. It would hold them accountable in a way that goes beyond public embarrassment. The Clark family has significant wealth and influence, and they've used both to marginalize people for years. A successful lawsuit would send a message that there are real consequences for this kind of behavior. She went on to explain that 3 other people who'd been featured in follow-up articles about the Clark family's behavior had already retained their services. There was strength in numbers, she said, and my case was the strongest because of the extreme nature of the humiliation and the family relationship involved. We'd be seeking monetary damages, of course, but more importantly, we'd be asking for a court order requiring the Clark family to undergo sensitivity training and to implement policies preventing this kind of discrimination at future events. After Rebecca hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, listening to the sound of the ocean and trying to process this new development. The idea of taking Marcus and his new family to court felt both terrifying and empowering. It would mean extending this conflict indefinitely, making it impossible for any of us to simply move on. But it would also mean ensuring that what happened to me wouldn't happen to anyone else. That afternoon, I called Helen to discuss the lawyer's offer. We met at our usual cafe overlooking the harbor, and I laid out everything Rebecca had told me. The question is, I said, stirring sugar into my rooibos tea, am I doing this for the right reasons? Is this about justice, or is it about punishing Marcus for disappointing me? Helen considered this carefully before responding. Cindy, You've spent Marcus's entire life putting his needs before your own. You worked double shifts to pay for his education. You sacrificed your own comfort so he could have opportunities. And when you needed him to simply acknowledge your worth as his mother, he failed completely. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Maybe it's time you put your own needs first for once. That evening, I video called Rebecca Martinez and told her I wanted to move forward with the lawsuit. She explained that the process would likely take months, possibly years, and that there would be attempts to settle out of court. The Clark family will probably offer you money to make this go away quietly, she warned me. They don't want the continued publicity that a court case would bring. And if they do, that's entirely your decision. But I want you to know that we believe your case is strong enough to win significant damages if it goes to trial. 2 days later, the lawsuit was filed in Seattle Superior Court. I learned about its public filing when James Whitmore from the Tribune called me for comment on the story his paper was already preparing. "Cindy, this is big news," he said, excitement clear in his voice. "You're the first person to challenge the Clark family legally over their discriminatory practices. This could set a precedent for how we handle social exclusion and prejudice in private events." The story about the lawsuit ran the next morning, and within hours my phone was ringing constantly. This time, though, many of the calls weren't from reporters. They were from other people who'd experienced similar treatment at high society events. People who'd been made to feel small and unwelcome because they didn't fit certain social expectations. A woman named Carol from Portland called to tell me about being excluded from her ex-husband's family events after their divorce because she worked as a house cleaner. A man named Robert from Vancouver shared his experience of being seated in a basement room during his daughter's wedding reception because his disability made the bride's family uncomfortable. Each story broke my heart a little more, but they also reinforced my conviction that this lawsuit was about something much larger than my personal grievance with Marcus and Madison. The response from Seattle, however, was swift and harsh. Within a week of the lawsuit filing, I received a call from a different attorney, this one representing Marcus and Madison. "Mrs. Porter." The voice was crisp, businesslike, and cold. "I'm Thomas Blackwell, representing Marcus Porter and Madison Clark Porter in the matter you've filed against the Clark family. My clients would like to resolve this matter quickly and amicably." "I'm listening," I said, though my hands were shaking. "They're prepared to offer you $50,000 to withdraw the lawsuit and sign a non-disclosure agreement. This would allow everyone to move forward without further public embarrassment." $50,000. It was more money than I'd ever seen at one time, enough to pay off my small mortgage and live comfortably for several years. But it would also mean silence about what had happened to me, and it would mean letting the Clark family continue their pattern of behavior without consequences. "I need time to think about it," I said. "Of course. But I should mention that if you decline this offer, my clients are prepared to mount a vigorous defense. They have significant resources, and they're confident they can prove that Mrs. Porter was treated appropriately given the circumstances." The implied threat was clear: take the money, or face a legal battle against people with unlimited resources and powerful connections. That night, I called Rebecca Martinez to discuss the settlement offer. "It's a substantial amount," she admitted. "And litigation is always risky, especially against defendants with deep pockets. But Cindy, I need you to understand what accepting this settlement would mean. The non-disclosure agreement would prevent you from ever speaking publicly about what happened. If anyone asks about the lawsuit, you'd have to remain silent. And if I refuse, then we go to court and we fight. It won't be easy. They'll try to paint you as a vindictive mother-in-law seeking attention and money. They'll argue that the seating arrangement was a minor inconvenience, that you've blown out of proportion. They might even try to claim that you were seated separately for your own comfort or safety." I thought about Marcus hearing attorneys describe me as vindictive and attention-seeking. I thought about having to sit in a courtroom while his wife's family portrayed me as a troublemaker who couldn't be satisfied with what they'd graciously provided. But I also thought about Carol, the house cleaner from Portland, and Robert, the disabled father from Vancouver, and all the other people who'd called to share their stories of being marginalized and excluded. "Rebecca," I said finally, "if we win this case, what kind of precedent would it set?" "It would establish that deliberate social humiliation can have legal consequences." It would make it harder for wealthy families to use their events as opportunities to enforce class hierarchies. It would give other people in similar situations a legal framework to seek justice. And if we lose, then at least we tried. And even in losing, we'd have put their behavior on public record. We'd have forced them to defend their actions in open court. I made my decision that night, sitting in my garden under the Southern Hemisphere stars. I called Rebecca the next morning and told her to reject the settlement offer. The news of my rejection made headlines in Seattle, with the Tribune running a story under the headline, "Wedding Discrimination Victim Rejects Settlement, Vows to Fight in Court." The article included a brief statement I'd provided through Rebecca. "This isn't about money. It's about ensuring that no other parent has to endure what I experienced at what should have been one of the happiest days of their child's life." The response was immediate and polarizing. Social media lit up with debates about my decision. Some people praised me for standing up to wealthy bullies, while others accused me of being greedy and vindictive. The comments sections of news articles became battlegrounds between those who supported my lawsuit and those who thought I was making too big a deal out of a seating arrangement. But what surprised me most was the number of people who came forward to support me financially. Someone started a crowdfunding page to help with my legal expenses, and within days, it had raised over $30,000 from small donations around the world. The contributors left messages of support that brought tears to my eyes. "My mother-in-law treated me like dirt for 20 years, wrote one woman. "Thank you for fighting back. As someone who's been excluded from family events because of my job, I'm so grateful you're taking a stand," wrote another. "You're fighting for all of us who've been made to feel less than," wrote a third. Meanwhile, the legal maneuvering intensified. The Clark family's attorneys filed motion after motion, trying to get the case dismissed on various technicalities. They argued that the statute of limitations had expired, that the court didn't have jurisdiction, that my claims didn't meet the legal standard for intentional infliction of emotional distress. Rebecca and her team fought back against each motion, and slowly, we began to win small victories. The judge rejected most of the dismissal attempts and ruled that the case could proceed to discovery, the phase where both sides would have to turn over documents and evidence. This was when things got really interesting. During discovery, Rebecca's team uncovered a treasure trove of evidence about the Clark family's discriminatory practices. Email exchanges between Madison and her mother discussing how to handle me at the wedding. Text messages from Madison's sister joking about, quote, hiding the poor relatives. Even a recorded voicemail from Richard Clark to the wedding planner, explicitly instructing them to seat me somewhere discreet where she won't be in any photos. But the most damning piece of evidence was a group chat between Madison's college friends, discovered on one of their phones during a related deposition. The messages, sent during my visit to Seattle, painted a picture of calculated cruelty that shocked even Rebecca. "OMG, Madison, is that his actual mother?" read one message, apparently sent with a photo taken surreptitiously during the wedding. "She looks so out of place, LOL, replied another. "I can't believe she actually came. Doesn't she know she doesn't belong here?" wrote a third. Madison's response was the worst. "Trust me, we made sure she knows her place. Mom had her seated behind the trash bins. She won't be ruining any of our photos." When Rebecca showed me these messages, I felt physically sick. The casual cruelty, the complete dehumanization, the way they'd turned my presence at my son's wedding into a joke among friends. It was worse than I'd imagined. "Cindy," Rebecca said gently, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Knowing what you know now, seeing how they really felt about you, do you want to continue with this lawsuit? Because once these messages become public record, there's no going back." I stared at the transcripts of those messages for a long time. My son had married into a family that saw me as a source of entertainment, as something to be mocked and hidden away, and he'd allowed it to happen. "Yes," I said finally, "I want everyone to see exactly who these people really are." The publication of the text messages sent shockwaves through Seattle's social scene. The Seattle Tribune obtained copies through court filings and published excerpts in a follow-up story that went viral within hours. The callous nature of the messages, especially Madison's comment about making sure I knew my place, sparked outrage that extended far beyond the Pacific Northwest. Suddenly, This wasn't just a local story about wedding etiquette gone wrong. It became a national conversation about class, privilege, and the way wealthy families treat people they consider beneath their status. The Clark family's reputation, built over generations of business success and charitable giving, crumbled almost overnight. Richard Clark's hotels faced boycott threats. Madison lost her marketing position at a prestigious firm. Even their charitable foundation saw donations dry up as the public learned about their private attitudes toward people of different economic backgrounds. But the cost to me was equally severe. Any remaining hope I'd had of reconciling with Marcus evaporated when he released a public statement through his attorney, distancing himself from my lawsuit and claiming that I was exploiting a private family matter for financial gain. Reading those words, seeing my son publicly characterize my fight for dignity as a money grab, broke something inside me that I didn't think could be fixed. This wasn't just about a wedding anymore. This was about who Marcus had become and who he'd chosen to align himself with. Helen flew up from Cape Town to be with me during the worst of the media scrutiny. She found me in my garden one evening, staring out at the ocean and clutching a printed copy of Marcus's statement. "I don't think I know my son anymore," I told her. "The boy I raised, the one who used to tell me I was the best mother in the world. I don't know what happened to him." Helen sat beside me on the garden bench that David had built years ago. "Maybe he's still in there somewhere," she said gently. "Maybe this whole experience will help him remember who he used to be. And if it doesn't, then you'll have learned something important about who he's chosen to become. And you'll have stood up for yourself and everyone else who's been treated the way you were. That has to count for something." As we moved closer to the trial date, the settlement offers increased. $75,000. $100,000. Finally, $250,000, along with a written apology from the Clark family. Each offer was tempting, especially as the legal bills mounted and the stress of the prolonged battle took its toll. But each time, I remembered those text messages, the casual cruelty with which they'd discussed me, the way they'd turned my love for my son into a source of amusement. The apology they offered was carefully worded, expressing regret for any misunderstanding about the wedding arrangements, and acknowledging that, quote, communication could have been better. It was an apology that apologized for nothing, while technically appearing to take responsibility. Rebecca advised me that we were unlikely to get a better settlement offer, and that trials were always risky. "Juries can be unpredictable," she warned. "And the Clark family will have very expensive attorneys who are good at making plaintiffs look unreasonable." But I'd come too far to back down now. The trial was scheduled to begin in 8 weeks, and I was determined to see it through. Then, 6 weeks before we were set to go to court, everything changed. I was having breakfast when my phone rang with another international number, this one from New York. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Patricia Wells, who identified herself as a producer for a major American news program. "Mrs. Porter, we've been following your story, and we'd like to offer you an opportunity to tell your side of things on national television. We're doing a segment on social discrimination and class prejudice, and your case would be the centerpiece. A national television interview. The opportunity to tell my story to millions of people, to put a human face on the issues the lawsuit was trying to address. The interview would air 2 weeks before your trial," Patricia continued. "It could help build public support for your case, but I need to warn you, the Clark family will have an opportunity to respond, and they've indicated they plan to participate. That meant Marcus and Madison would likely be interviewed as well, defending their actions and probably painting me as an unstable, attention-seeking mother-in-law who couldn't let go of a minor social slight. The thought of facing my son on national television, of having our family conflict played out in front of millions of strangers, made me physically ill, but it also represented an opportunity to reach people who might never read about the lawsuit, to share my story with other parents who'd been marginalized by their children's new families. I told Patricia I needed time to think about it, but deep down, I already knew what my answer would be. That evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set over the Atlantic, watching the waves crash against the rocks below my house. Tomorrow, I would call Patricia Wells and agree to the interview. In 2 weeks, I would sit across from a television host and tell the world about the worst experience of my life. And somehow, despite everything that had happened, despite all the pain and public scrutiny and family destruction, I felt at peace with that decision. Because this had never really been about the wedding, or the lawsuit, or even about Marcus. It had been about finding my voice after decades of staying quiet. About refusing to accept poor treatment just to keep the peace. Whatever happened next, I would face it with my dignity intact and my truth told. And for the first time since I'd stepped off that plane in Seattle all those months ago, that felt like enough. The television studio in New York was smaller than I'd imagined, but the bright lights and multiple cameras made it feel overwhelming nonetheless. I sat in the makeup chair, watching the artist carefully apply foundation while trying to calm my racing heart. In less than an hour, I would be sitting across from one of America's most respected news anchors, telling my story to an audience of millions. Patricia Wells had flown me to New York 3 days early to prepare for the interview. We'd spent hours going over potential questions, practicing my responses, and discussing how to present my case in a way that would resonate with viewers who might not understand the nuances of social discrimination. Remember, Patricia had told me during our final prep session, "You're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for everyone who's ever been made to feel invisible or unwelcome at events that should have celebrated them." Now, sitting in that makeup chair with my hands trembling slightly, I tried to channel that sense of purpose. This wasn't about revenge against Marcus or settling scores with Madison's family. This was about shining a light on behavior that too many people accepted as normal. The makeup artist, a kind woman named Rosa, noticed my nervousness. "First time on television?" she asked gently. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "You'll do fine," she said, applying lipstick with steady hands. "Just remember to look at the interviewer, not the cameras. Pretend you're having a conversation with a friend." A friend. I thought about Helen, who was watching from our hotel room, and tried to imagine I was telling this story to her instead of to millions of strangers. 20 minutes later, I was seated across from anchor David Morrison in the studio's interview area. The set was designed to look like an elegant living room, with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that was supposed to put guests at ease. David was exactly as he appeared on television, professional, warm, and somehow both approachable and authoritative. "We'll start with some background questions," he told me during the final sound check. "Then we'll get into the specifics of what happened at the wedding." The segment will run about 12 minutes, which is quite long for this format, so we'll have time to really explore the issues. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. "And remember," David added, "millions of people are rooting for you. The response to your story has been extraordinary. You're not alone in this." When the cameras started rolling, David's demeanor shifted into his professional mode. "Good evening. I'm David Morrison, and tonight we're examining a story that has sparked a national conversation about class, privilege, and family loyalty. It began with a wedding invitation, but it's become so much more." He turned to me with a gentle smile. "Lucinda Porter, thank you for joining us tonight. You traveled 8,000 miles from South Africa to attend your son's wedding in Seattle. Tell us what you expected that day to be like." I took a deep breath and began. "David, I expected it to be one of the happiest days of my life. My son Marcus was marrying a woman he loved, and I thought I would finally get to meet her family and become part of their lives. I'd saved for months to make the trip, bought a special dress, prepared myself to welcome a new daughter-in-law. Instead, you found yourself seated behind garbage bins at the back of the ballroom. How did that make you feel?" The question I dreaded, but also the one I most needed to answer honestly. "Invisible," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my chest. Like I was something shameful that needed to be hidden away. I'd raised Marcus alone after my husband died, worked double shifts to give him opportunities, sacrificed so much to help him build a better life. And at his wedding, I was treated like an embarrassment. David's follow-up questions were thoughtful and probing, but never aggressive. He asked about the text messages that had been discovered during the lawsuit, about the pattern of discrimination the Clark family had exhibited, about the impact this had all had on my relationship with Marcus. "Your son has publicly stated that you're exploiting a private family matter for financial gain," David said, his tone carefully neutral. "How do you respond to that?" This was the question that cut deepest, but I'd prepared for it. David, if this was about money, I would have accepted one of the substantial settlement offers the Clark family made. I turned down $250,000. Because this isn't about financial compensation, it's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no other parent has to endure what I experienced. You've become something of a symbol for people who felt marginalized or excluded. Was that your intention when you first spoke to the Seattle Tribune? I shook my head. Not at all. Initially, I just wanted someone to understand what had happened to me, to validate that it was wrong. But when the story resonated with so many other people who'd had similar experiences, I realized this was bigger than just my personal hurt. The interview continued for what felt like hours, but was actually only about 15 minutes. David asked about my childhood in South Africa, about raising Marcus as a single mother, about the decision to pursue the lawsuit despite the personal cost. "What would you say to your son if he were watching tonight?" David asked as we neared the end of the segment. I looked directly into the camera, imagining Marcus somewhere watching this broadcast. I would tell him that I love him, that I always will, but that love doesn't mean accepting poor treatment. I would tell him that the boy I raised knew the difference between right and wrong, and I hope that man is still in there somewhere. After the cameras stopped rolling, David shook my hand warmly. "That was beautifully done," he said. "I think you reached a lot of people tonight." The response to the interview was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour of the broadcast, my phone was buzzing with messages from Rebecca Martinez, from James Whitmore at the Tribune, from friends back in Cape Town who'd managed to find a way to watch online. But more importantly, Patricia Wells called to tell me about the public reaction. "The network's phone lines are jammed," she said, excitement clear in her voice. "Social media is exploding with support for you. And Cindy, we've gotten calls from 3 other major networks wanting to do follow-up interviews." I declined the additional interviews, feeling emotionally drained from the first one. But the impact of the broadcast became clear over the following days as the story gained new momentum. The Clark family had indeed provided their own statement to the program, delivered by their attorney rather than appearing on camera themselves. Their response was predictably defensive, characterizing the wedding seating as a, quote, misunderstanding, and describing me as someone who, quote, refused multiple attempts at reconciliation. But their statement only seemed to make viewers angrier. The comments on the network's website and social media were overwhelmingly supportive of my position. People shared their own stories of being excluded or marginalized, and many expressed outrage at the Clark family's continued refusal to take responsibility for their actions. More significantly, the interview had attracted attention from other attorneys around the country who specialized in discrimination cases. Rebecca received calls from colleagues offering support and sharing similar cases they were working on. "This is becoming a movement," Rebecca told me during one of our phone calls. "Your case is inspiring other people to speak up about discrimination they've experienced." That interview gave a face and a voice to something a lot of people have felt but never known how to articulate. 3 weeks later, I was back in Seattle for the trial. The courthouse was surrounded by reporters and protesters, some supporting me, others defending the Clark family. I walked through the crowd with Rebecca and her team, trying to ignore the shouted questions and camera flashes. The trial itself was emotionally grueling but strangely cathartic. For 3 days, I sat in that courtroom and listened as Rebecca methodically presented our case. The evidence was damning. The text messages, the email exchanges, the recorded voicemail from Richard Clark, explicitly ordering that I be seated somewhere discreet. When I took the stand to testify, I found myself looking out at a courtroom packed with strangers who'd come to support me. In the front row sat Helen, who'd flown from Cape Town to be there. Behind her were some of the other people who'd experienced discrimination at Clark family events, the ones whose stories had become part of the broader narrative. And in the back, almost hidden behind a pillar, I saw a familiar figure that made my heart stop. Marcus was there, wearing a dark suit and sitting alone, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I saw something there that I hadn't seen since his childhood. Uncertainty, maybe even regret. But then Madison appeared beside him, taking his arm and whispering something in his ear that made him look away. The defense's case was exactly what Rebecca had predicted. They painted me as a vindictive mother-in-law who couldn't accept her diminished role in her son's life. They argued that the seating arrangement was a minor inconvenience, that I'd blown out of proportion for attention and financial gain. Madison took the stand in her own defense, looking elegant and composed in a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly income. She testified that the wedding seating had been a logistical challenge, and that they'd done their best to accommodate everyone. Mrs. Porter was provided with a seat that offered a clear view of the ceremony, she said, her voice steady and confident. Any suggestion that she was deliberately marginalized is simply untrue. When Rebecca cross-examined Madison, she produced the text messages that had been discovered during discovery. Reading them aloud in that courtroom, with Madison sitting just a few feet away, was one of the most satisfying moments of the entire process. You wrote to your friends, "Trust me, we made sure she knows her place." Mom had her seated behind the pyramid trash bins. Do you remember sending that message? Madison's composure cracked slightly. I was upset about the wedding stress. Sometimes people say things they don't mean when they're under pressure. So you did seat Mrs. Porter behind garbage bins? The seating arrangements were complex. Yes or no, Ms. Clark Porter? Was the mother of the groom seated behind garbage bins at your wedding? A long pause. The area where she was seated was near service stations, yes. And you found this amusing enough to joke about with your friends? Another pause. I regret the tone of those messages. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. During that time, I sat in a conference room with Rebecca and her team, trying to process everything that had happened. Regardless of the verdict, I felt like I'd accomplished something important. The truth had been told in open court. The Clark family's behavior had been exposed to public scrutiny. Other people who'd experienced similar treatment had been given a voice. When the jury returned, the foreman stood to read their verdict. In the matter of Porter versus Clark et al., we find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. The courtroom erupted. I heard Helen gasp behind me, felt Rebecca squeeze my hand, saw photographers rushing to capture the moment. But all I could focus on was the feeling of vindication washing over me like a wave. The jury awarded me $250,000 in damages, not as much as we'd hoped for, but substantial enough to send a message. More importantly, they'd agreed with our argument that the Clark family's actions constituted intentional infliction of emotional distress. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca held a brief press conference while I stood beside her, still trying to process what had just happened. This verdict sends a clear message, Rebecca told the assembled reporters. Wealth and social status do not give anyone the right to humiliate or marginalize other people. The jury recognized that Mrs. Porter was the victim of deliberate, calculated cruelty, and they held the perpetrators accountable. A reporter shouted a question. Mrs. Porter, how do you feel about winning your case? I stepped forward to the microphone, my heart pounding but my voice steady. I feel grateful that 12 strangers were willing to listen to my story and recognize that what happened to me was wrong. But this victory isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who's ever been made to feel invisible or unwelcome at events that should have celebrated them. The Clark family's attorney announced that they would appeal the verdict, but Rebecca was confident that the judgment would stand. The evidence was overwhelming. She told me as we walked away from the courthouse. They'll appeal because they have to, but they're not going to win. That evening, I had dinner with Helen at a quiet restaurant near my hotel. We sat by the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline as the sun set behind the Olympic Mountains. So what happens now? Helen asked. I thought about her question carefully. Now I go home. I go back to my life in Cape Town, to my work, to the people who love me for who I am rather than what I can do for them. And Marcus? I sighed, thinking about my son's face in the courtroom, the conflict I'd seen there. I don't know. Maybe someday he'll realize what he lost when he chose status over family. Maybe he won't. But I can't wait for him to change. I have to live my own life. The flight home to Cape Town was peaceful in a way that my journey to Seattle had never been. This time, I wasn't traveling toward uncertainty and hope that would be crushed. I was traveling toward a life that I'd built for myself, toward people who valued me, toward a future that I controlled. 6 months later, I was sitting in my garden with my morning coffee when an international package arrived. Inside was a letter with no return address and a check for the full amount of the jury award. The Clark family had apparently decided not to appeal after all. But it wasn't the money that caught my attention. It was the letter. Written in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. "Mom," it began. "I don't know how to start this, or even if you'll want to read it. But I need you to know that I've been thinking about everything that happened, everything I allowed to happen." I set down my coffee cup and continued reading, my hands trembling slightly. I watched your interview on television. I was in the courtroom during the trial. I heard the things Madison and her family said about you, and I finally understood what I'd been too selfish or too cowardly to see before. You deserved so much better than what you got from me. The letter went on for 3 pages, Marcus pouring out his regret and his realization of how badly he'd failed me. He wrote about the pressure he'd felt to fit into Madison's world, about the gradual way he'd allowed himself to be convinced that I was somehow beneath their social level. "I know I can't undo what happened," he wrote near the end. "I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't fix the pain I caused you. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you, even when I was acting like I didn't. You were the best mother anyone could ask for, and I threw that away for people who saw you as an embarrassment." The letter ended with a phone number and an invitation. "If you're ever willing to talk to me, I'd like that. Not because I think I deserve forgiveness, but because I miss my mom. I miss the woman who raised me to be better than the man I became." I sat in my garden for a long time after reading that letter, watching the waves crash against the rocks below, and thinking about forgiveness, about second chances, about the complicated relationship between love and disappointment. That evening, I picked up my phone and dialed the number Marcus had provided. He answered on the second ring, his voice tentative and hopeful. "Mom?" "Hello, Marcus," I said, and for the first time in over a year, calling him my son didn't hurt. We talked for 2 hours that night, and many more times over the following weeks. It wasn't easy. There was a lot of hurt to work through, a lot of trust to rebuild. But slowly, carefully, we began to reconstruct some version of our relationship. Marcus had separated from Madison, he told me. The stress of the lawsuit and the public scrutiny had revealed fundamental differences in their values that couldn't be overcome. He was living alone now, working to understand how he'd lost his way so completely. "I don't know if I can ever make this right," he said during one of our calls. "But I want to try. I want to be the son you raised me to be." A year later, Marcus came to Cape Town for Christmas. It was his first visit to South Africa since he'd left for university, and seeing him in my small house, helping me prepare dinner and sitting by the ocean where he'd played as a child, felt like a kind of miracle. We talked about everything. The wedding, the lawsuit, the years of distance that had grown between us. We talked about David, his father, and about the man Marcus was trying to become. "I'm proud of you for fighting back," he told me one evening as we sat in the garden watching the sunset. "I'm proud that you didn't let them silence you, even when it meant losing me." "I never wanted to lose you," I said. "But I couldn't lose myself either." On New Year's Eve, we walked along the beach together, and Marcus apologized again for everything that had happened. This time, I was ready to accept his apology and to forgive him. Not because what he'd done was acceptable, but because the man walking beside me was genuinely remorseful and working to change. The lawsuit had been about justice, about accountability, about refusing to accept poor treatment. But this moment, walking with my son along the beach where his father had once carried him on his shoulders, was about something deeper. It was about the possibility of redemption, about the power of love to survive even our worst failures. 2 years after that humiliating day at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, I received a letter from a woman in Chicago who'd read about my case. She'd been excluded from her daughter's engagement party because her ex-husband's new wife found her, quote, inappropriate for the social circle. Inspired by my story, she'd confronted her daughter and demanded an apology. The daughter had not only apologized but had insisted on throwing a second party that celebrated her mother properly. Similar letters arrived regularly. People who'd found the courage to stand up for themselves, families who'd reconciled after one member had been marginalized, individuals who'd learned to value their own dignity over other people's approval. Each letter reminded me that the pain I'd endured had served a purpose beyond my personal healing. It had started conversations, changed behaviors, and given voice to people who'd been silent too long. Looking back now, I sometimes think about the woman who stepped off that plane in Seattle 2 years ago, so full of hope and excitement about her son's wedding. I think about how naive she was, how unprepared for the cruelty she was about to encounter. But I also think about her strength, about the decision she made to smile and clap while sitting behind those garbage bins, knowing that this humiliation was just the beginning of something much larger. She couldn't have known that her quiet dignity in that moment would eventually spark a national conversation about respect and equality. The relationship between Marcus and me will never be exactly what it was before. Too much has happened, too much trust was broken. But it's something new now, built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, rather than the old dynamic where my love was taken for granted. He's working as a software engineer for a nonprofit now, using his skills to build technology that helps underserved communities. It's meaningful work that pays far less than his previous job, but he seems happier, more at peace with himself. I learned something from watching you fight that lawsuit, he told me during his last visit. I learned that sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything to find out who you really are. Last month, I received an invitation that made me smile. Marcus is engaged again, this time to a teacher named Sarah who works with refugee children. The wedding will be small, held in a community center in the neighborhood where she teaches. The invitation specifically mentions that the ceremony will be followed by a reception, where quote, every guest will be seated with equal honor and celebration. I've already bought my plane ticket. As I sit in my garden this morning watching the sun rise over the Atlantic Ocean, I think about the journey that brought me here. It began with a wedding invitation and a dream of being welcomed into my son's new family. It led through the darkest period of my life, through public humiliation and legal battles and the painful reconstruction of my relationship with my child. But it ended with something I'd never expected to find. The unshakable knowledge that I am worthy of respect, that my voice matters, and that sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight not just for ourselves but for everyone who comes after us. The waves crash against the rocks below, constant and eternal, reminding me that some things endure no matter how much the world around them changes. Love endures, truth endures, dignity endures. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to fight for them, they even triumph. The morning Marcus called to tell me about his engagement to Sarah, I was tending to the small herb garden I'd planted behind my house. My hands were dirty with soil, and the smell of rosemary and thyme filled the air as I worked among the plants that reminded me of the spice gardens my grandmother had kept when I was a child. When my phone rang and I saw his name on the screen, my heart did the same little flutter it had done since he was born. Some things never change, no matter how much pain passes between a mother and her child. Mom, his voice was different somehow, lighter than it had been in years. I have something to tell you, and I wanted you to hear it from me first. I sat down on the small wooden bench David had built decades ago, wiping my hands on my gardening apron. I'm listening, sweetheart. I'm getting married again. The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been practicing them. Her name is Sarah Chen. And Mom, she's nothing like Madison. She's kind and genuine, and she already knows all about you, about what happened, about everything. I felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over me. Joy that Marcus had found love again, but also a flutter of anxiety about whether I'd be welcome at this wedding, whether history might repeat itself in some new and painful way. Tell me about her, I said, settling back against the bench and closing my eyes to better focus on his voice. She's a teacher at an elementary school in a low-income neighborhood. She works with refugee children, helping them learn English and adjust to life in America. She grew up in a small town in Oregon, raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. As Marcus continued talking about Sarah, I could hear something in his voice that had been missing when he'd talked about Madison. There was warmth there, genuine affection rather than the pride and status consciousness that had colored his descriptions of his first bride. She wants to meet you, Marcus said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Actually, she's been asking about you since our second date. She said any man who would let his mother be treated the way I let you be treated wasn't worth her time, and I had to prove I'd learned from my mistakes before she'd consider a future with me. I laughed, despite myself. I like her already. Mom, there's something else. Sarah insisted that I ask you this properly, not just assume you'd say yes. Would you be willing to come to our wedding? Not as an obligation or an afterthought, but as my honored guest? As the woman who raised me and deserves to be celebrated for that. The tears came then, unexpected and overwhelming. I pressed my free hand to my mouth, trying to compose myself enough to speak. Marcus, I whispered, nothing would make me happier. And Mom? Sarah wants you to help plan it. She doesn't have family left, and she said she'd be honored if you'd help her choose flowers and music and all the things mothers and daughters usually do together. After we hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, letting the South African sun warm my face while I processed this unexpected turn. For so long I'd believed that my relationship with Marcus was irreparably damaged, that the trust between us could never be fully rebuilt. But here he was, not just inviting me to his wedding but asking me to be part of planning it. 2 weeks later, Sarah called me directly. Her voice was warm and slightly nervous as she introduced herself. Mrs. Porter, I hope you don't mind me calling like this. Marcus gave me your number, and I wanted to introduce myself properly. Please, call me Cindy, I said. And I don't mind at all. I've been hoping to hear from you. I want you to know that I've read everything about what happened at Marcus's first wedding. The newspaper articles, the court transcripts, everything. And I want you to know that nothing like that will ever happen again, not while I have anything to say about it. Her directness surprised and relieved me. Thank you for saying that, Sarah. It means more than you know. Mrs. Porter, Cindy, I lost my parents when I was young, and my grandmother raised me. She died 2 years ago, and I don't have any family left. When Marcus told me about you, about the woman who raised him alone and sacrificed so much for him, I thought maybe we could be family to each other. If you're open to that. I found myself crying again, but these were different tears than the ones I'd shed over the past few years. These were tears of joy, of possibility, of a future I'd never dared to imagine. I would love that more than anything, I managed to say. Over the following months, Sarah and I developed a relationship that felt both natural and healing. She called me every Sunday, and we spent hours talking about everything from wedding plans to her work with refugee children, to my memories of Marcus as a boy. Sarah was everything Marcus had said and more. She was intelligent and passionate about her work, but without any of the pretension or status consciousness that had characterized Madison. When she sent me photos of herself, I saw a young woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile, someone who looked comfortable in her own skin regardless of what she was wearing or where she was standing. The wedding planning became a source of joy for both of us. Sarah included me in every decision, asking for my opinions on everything from the color of the tablecloths to the selection of music for the ceremony. When she learned that I was a seamstress, she asked if I'd be willing to help her alter her wedding dress. A simple but elegant gown she'd found at a consignment shop that had belonged to someone's grandmother. I love that it has history, she told me during one of our video calls, holding up the dress for me to see. I love that it was worn by someone who was loved, who was happy. It feels like good luck. I agreed to help with the alterations, and Sarah arranged to fly to Cape Town a month before the wedding so we could work on the dress together and spend time getting to know each other in person. When she stepped off the plane at Cape Town International Airport, I recognized her immediately, despite having only seen photos. She moved with the confident but unpretentious bearing of someone who was comfortable with herself, and when she spotted me in the crowd, her face lit up with genuine pleasure. Cindy, she called out, hurrying toward me with her arms outstretched. The hug she gave me was warm and unguarded, the kind of embrace I dreamed Madison might have offered but never received. When we pulled apart, Sarah's eyes were bright with tears. Thank you for welcoming me, she said. I know this situation is complicated, and I want you to know how much it means to me that you're giving me a chance. I took her hands in mine, looking into her face and seeing nothing but sincerity there. Sarah, you're not complicated. You're exactly what I'd hoped for my son. Someone who sees his worth and brings out the best in him. During Sarah's week in Cape Town, We worked on her dress in my small sewing room, but more importantly, we talked. She told me about growing up with her grandmother, about the challenges of working with children who'd fled violence and trauma in their home countries, about her hopes for her marriage to Marcus. "I need you to know," she said one afternoon as I pinned the hem of her dress, "that Marcus and I have talked extensively about what happened at his first wedding. He's done a lot of work on himself since then, a lot of therapy and self-reflection. He knows he failed you, and he's committed to never failing you again." I looked up from my pinning to meet her eyes. "And you believe he's changed?" "I do," she said without hesitation. "But more than that, I won't let him backslide. I've made it clear that our relationship depends on him maintaining a good relationship with you. You're not optional in our lives, Cindy. You're essential." That evening, Sarah and I sat on my small patio overlooking the ocean, sharing a bottle of South African wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, her voice thoughtful. "Do you think you'll ever be able to fully forgive Marcus for what happened?" I considered her question carefully, swirling the wine in my glass. "I think I already have, mostly. Not because what he did was okay, but because holding on to that anger was poisoning me. The lawsuit was about justice and accountability, but forgiveness, that's about my own peace of mind. And what about trust? Do you trust him again?" "I'm learning to," I said honestly. "Trust has to be rebuilt over time, through actions rather than words. But the fact that he chose you, someone who values me and insists on treating me with respect, that tells me something important about who he's becoming." Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand. "I promise you, Cindy, that as long as Marcus and I are together, you'll always have a place in our family. You'll always be honored and respected and loved." The week passed too quickly, but by the time Sarah left to return to Seattle, I felt like I'd gained not just a daughter-in-law, but a true daughter of the heart. The dress fit her perfectly, and more importantly, our relationship felt perfectly fitted too. 3 weeks before the wedding, I received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was professional but warm, belonging to someone who introduced herself as Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the University of Washington School of Social Work. "Mrs. Porter, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I'm calling because I've been following your story since the Seattle Tribune first published it, and I wondered if you might be interested in speaking to some of our graduate students about your experience." I was puzzled by the request. I'm not sure what I could offer to social work students. "Actually, quite a lot," Dr. Walsh said. "Your case has become something of a landmark in discussions about social discrimination and class-based exclusion. We're using it in our courses on advocacy and social justice. The students would benefit enormously from hearing your perspective directly." The idea of speaking to university students was both flattering and intimidating, but I found myself agreeing to participate via video conference when I returned to Cape Town after the wedding. "There's something else," Dr. Walsh continued. "We're also developing a research project on family dynamics and social exclusion, and we'd love to include your story as a case study. Obviously, this would be done with complete confidentiality and your full consent." After we hung up, I reflected on how my painful experience had somehow transformed into something that could help other people. The lawsuit had been about accountability, but this felt like something more, an opportunity to contribute to understanding and preventing similar situations in the future. The week before Marcus and Sarah's wedding, I flew to Seattle for the second time in 3 years. But everything about this trip was different from my first visit. This time, Marcus and Sarah picked me up at the airport themselves, both of them beaming as they spotted me in the arrivals area. This time, I wasn't staying at a run-down bed and breakfast, but in the guest room of the small house Marcus and Sarah had bought together in a quiet neighborhood filled with families and teachers and social workers, rather than business executives and social climbers. This time, when Sarah's friends and colleagues came to meet me, they greeted me with genuine warmth and curiosity about my life in South Africa, rather than barely concealed disdain for my social status. The wedding was held at the community center where Sarah taught her refugee students, a simple building that had been transformed with flowers from the school's garden and decorations made by Sarah's students. It was everything the Fairmont Olympic Hotel was not: humble, genuine, filled with love rather than ostentation. As I helped Sarah get ready in the small room they'd designated as her bridal suite, I thought about the contrast with her predecessor. Sarah's wedding dress was the one we'd altered together, paired with her grandmother's pearl necklace and shoes she'd bought at a discount store. She looked absolutely radiant, but more importantly, she looked like herself. "Are you nervous?" I asked as I helped fasten her necklace. "About marrying Marcus?" "Not at all," she said, meeting my eyes in the mirror. "About whether I'll be a good wife and daughter-in-law?" "A little." "Sarah," I said, placing my hands on her shoulders, "you're already the daughter I never had but always hoped for. Marcus is the luckiest man in the world." When it came time for the ceremony, I walked down the short aisle to my seat, front row, center, exactly where the mother of the groom belonged. The chair had a small card on it that read, "Reserved for Cindy Porter, mother of the groom," and seeing my name there, printed in elegant script and displayed with pride rather than hidden away, brought tears to my eyes. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. Sarah's students sang a song they'd learned in their English class, their young voices filling the room with hope and joy. Marcus's vows spoke of learning from his mistakes and promising to honor both his wife and his family with his actions, rather than just his words. Sarah's vows included a promise to cherish and respect all the people who had shaped Marcus into the man she loved, especially the remarkable woman who raised him with such strength and grace. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the entire room erupted in applause and cheers. But what moved me most was watching Marcus's face as he kissed his new bride. There was none of the performative satisfaction I'd seen at his first wedding, just pure joy and love. At the reception, I found myself seated at the head table with the wedding party, a position of honor that felt completely natural and appropriate. Sarah had assigned her former college roommate to be my handler for the evening, making sure I always had someone to talk to and ensuring that I was included in all the conversations and festivities. During the dinner, Marcus stood to give a speech that made everyone in the room cry, including me. "Most of you know that this isn't my first wedding," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "And most of you probably know that I made some serious mistakes the first time around. I hurt someone who deserved nothing but love and respect from me, my mother." He turned to look at me directly. "Mom, I can't undo what I did to you 3 years ago. I can't take back the pain I caused or the trust I broke. But I can promise you that the man standing here today is not the same man who failed you so badly. I've learned what really matters, and what really matters is treating the people we love with the dignity and respect they deserve, regardless of what anyone else thinks." The applause that followed was thunderous, but I barely heard it through my tears. Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Sarah and I found ourselves alone for a few minutes while Marcus was saying goodbye to some departing guests. "Thank you," she said simply, taking my hands in hers. "For what? For raising him to be capable of learning from his mistakes. For fighting back when they tried to diminish you. For giving me a chance when you had every reason to be suspicious of any woman Marcus brought home." I squeezed her hands. "Thank you for loving him enough to demand better from him. Thank you for making me part of your family from the very beginning." The next morning, I had breakfast with Marcus and Sarah before their departure for their honeymoon. A modest trip to the Oregon coast where Sarah wanted to show Marcus the small town where she'd grown up. As we sat around their kitchen table sharing coffee and pastries, I marveled at how different this morning after felt compared to the aftermath of Marcus's first wedding. This time there was no rushing off to exclusive honeymoon destinations, no dismissive text messages, no sense that I was an obligation to be managed. Instead, we lingered over breakfast, sharing stories and making plans for future visits. "I want to come to Cape Town for Christmas," Sarah said. "I want to see where Marcus grew up, meet your friends, experience your life there." "And I want to come back here for your first anniversary," I replied. "I want to see your students, visit the school where you work, understand this life you've built together." When it came time for me to leave for the airport, both Marcus and Sarah hugged me tightly. But it was Marcus who held on the longest, whispering in my ear words that healed wounds I'd thought might never close. "I love you, Mom. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember how to show it properly. The flight home to Cape Town was peaceful in a way I'd never experienced before. As the plane rose above Seattle and headed south toward my home, I felt a sense of completeness that had been missing for years. My family was whole again, not in the same way it had been before, but in a new way that felt stronger and more honest. 3 months after the wedding, Dr. Walsh invited me to speak to her students as we discussed. The video conference was scheduled for a Saturday morning Cape Town time, which meant Friday evening in Seattle. I set up my laptop in my living room, with the window open so the students could hear the sound of the ocean in the background. 30 graduate students gathered in their classroom to hear my story, but this time I wasn't telling it as a victim seeking justice. I was telling it as someone who had fought back and won, who had reclaimed her dignity and rebuilt her relationships on a stronger foundation. The questions the students asked were thoughtful and probing. They wanted to know about the emotional toll of the legal battle, about the decision to go public with my story, about the process of rebuilding trust with Marcus. But the question that stayed with me long after the session ended came from a young woman who asked, "Do you think your experience would have been different if you'd had more money or higher social status? Or was this really about the fundamental lack of respect for you as a person?" I thought about her question for a long time before answering. I think wealthy people and poor people both deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. The problem wasn't that I couldn't afford an expensive dress or that I didn't know the right people. The problem was that Marcus's first wife and her family saw those things as more important than basic human decency. After the session ended, several students emailed me privately to share their own stories of family conflict and social exclusion. Reading their messages, I realized that my experience had resonated with people far beyond what I'd ever imagined. 6 months later, Dr. Walsh contacted me again with another opportunity. She'd received a grant to conduct a research study on family dynamics and social exclusion, and she wanted to interview me in depth for the project. "Your case has become a touchstone for our understanding of how class differences can fracture families," she explained. "We want to document not just what happened to you, but how you responded to it and what the long-term outcomes have been." The research interviews took place over several months, conducted via video conference with Dr. Walsh and her research team. They were interested in everything: my childhood in South Africa, my relationship with David, the process of raising Marcus as a single mother, the gradual changes in our relationship after he moved to America, and of course, the events surrounding both weddings. But they were particularly interested in the recovery process, how Marcus and I had rebuilt our relationship, what had made that possible, and what lessons might be applicable to other families dealing with similar conflicts. "What do you think was the turning point?" Dr. Walsh asked during one of our sessions. "What made it possible for Marcus to recognize what he'd done and commit to changing?" "I think it was several things," I said after considering the question. "The public nature of the lawsuit forced him to see his actions through other people's eyes. The breakdown of his marriage to Madison removed the pressure to maintain appearances. And meeting Sarah gave him an example of how relationships should work when they're based on genuine respect rather than social positioning." "And what made forgiveness possible for you?" "Understanding that forgiveness wasn't about condoning what he'd done or pretending it didn't matter. It was about freeing myself from the burden of carrying that anger. And seeing genuine change in his behavior, not just his words." A year after Sarah and Marcus's wedding, they came to Cape Town for Christmas as planned. Sarah fell in love with my small coastal town, spending hours walking along the beaches and exploring the local markets. She was particularly interested in visiting the schools in the township where I'd grown up, wanting to understand the educational challenges facing children in post-apartheid South Africa. "I'd love to do some volunteer work here," she told me one evening as we sat in my garden, watching the sunset. "Maybe we could set up an exchange program between my school in Seattle and some of the schools here." Marcus, meanwhile, seemed more relaxed and happy than I'd seen him since his childhood. Away from the pressures of Seattle's tech industry and social expectations, he reverted to the thoughtful, curious young man I remembered. He spent hours asking me about his father's family, wanting to understand his South African heritage in a way he'd never shown interest in before. "I think I lost track of who I was when I moved to America," he told me one afternoon as we walked along the beach where he'd played as a child. "I was so focused on becoming successful, on fitting in, that I forgot where I came from and what really mattered." "And now?" Now I remember. Now I want to be the man you and Dad raised me to be, not the man I thought I needed to be to impress other people. During their visit, Sarah and I worked together to plan a small celebration for Marcus's birthday. It was nothing elaborate, just a dinner at my house with a few of my close friends, including Helen, who'd become like family to all of us. As we sat around my dining table that evening, sharing stories and laughing together, I looked around at the faces illuminated by candlelight and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. 3 years earlier, I'd sat alone in a hotel room in Seattle, feeling like I'd lost my son forever. Now, here we were, a real family again, but one built on honesty and mutual respect rather than obligation and guilt. The evening ended with Marcus standing to make a toast. "To my mother," he said, raising his glass of South African wine, "who taught me that love means fighting for what's right, even when it's difficult. Who showed me that dignity isn't something that can be taken away from you. It's something you choose to maintain, regardless of how others treat you. And who loved me enough to hold me accountable when I lost my way." As glasses clinked around the table, I caught Sarah's eye and saw her smile with the satisfaction of someone who'd helped engineer this moment of healing. 2 years later, I received a call that brought my story full circle. It was from a woman named Patricia, who'd read about my case in a family law journal and wanted to share her own experience. My daughter-in-law seated me in the kitchen during their wedding reception. Patricia told me. She said it was because I'd be more comfortable there, but I knew it was because she was ashamed of me. "I read about your lawsuit, and I wanted to know, do you think I should fight back?" I talked with Patricia for over an hour, sharing what I'd learned about the importance of standing up for yourself, while also being honest about the costs involved. In the end, the decision was hers to make, but I was able to connect her with Rebecca Martinez's law firm and with some of the support groups that had formed for people dealing with family exclusion. Patricia's story was just one of dozens I heard over the following months. My case had apparently opened the floodgates for people who'd been quietly enduring similar treatment, and many of them reached out to me for advice and support. With Dr. Walsh's encouragement, I started writing a book about my experience, not just the legal battle, but the emotional journey of learning to value myself enough to demand better treatment. The writing process was therapeutic, forcing me to revisit painful memories, but also helping me understand how much I'd grown and changed. The book, titled A Place at the Table, A Mother's Fight for Dignity, was published 2 years later by a small press that specialized in social justice narratives. It didn't become a bestseller, but it found its audience among people who'd experienced similar marginalization and exclusion. The most rewarding part of publication was the letters I received from readers, parents who'd been excluded from their children's weddings, children who'd been pressured to choose between their parents and their spouses, family members who'd been made to feel unwelcome at gatherings. They all wrote to share their stories and to thank me for giving voice to their experiences. On the 5th anniversary of Marcus and Sarah's wedding, they threw a party to celebrate not just their marriage but our family's journey toward healing. The party was held in their backyard in Seattle, with many of the same people who'd attended their wedding. During the celebration, Sarah pulled me aside to share some news. "Cindy, we have something to tell you," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "We're pregnant." The joy that flooded through me was immediate and overwhelming. A grandchild, something I'd wondered if I'd ever experience, given the state of my relationship with Marcus just a few years earlier. "Does this mean I'll finally get to be the grandmother I always dreamed of being?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. "It means you'll be the most loved and honored grandmother in the world," Sarah said, pulling me into a tight hug. That evening, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, Marcus and I found ourselves alone on his back porch. The Seattle skyline twinkled in the distance, and I thought about all the times I'd looked at that same skyline with such different emotions: hope, devastation, determination, and now, contentment. "Mom," Marcus said, settling into the chair beside mine, "I need you to know something. This baby, our child, is going to grow up knowing their grandmother's story. Not the painful parts necessarily, but the important parts. They're going to know that their grandmother is a woman who fought for what was right, who refused to accept poor treatment, who taught their father how to be a better man. And what story will you tell them about yourself?" I asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I'll tell them that I made serious mistakes, but that their grandmother loved me enough to hold me accountable. I'll tell them that love isn't just about accepting everything someone does. Sometimes it's about demanding better from them. And I'll tell them that the strongest person I know is their grandmother, who flew 8,000 miles to celebrate her son's wedding and ended up teaching an entire country about dignity and respect. 6 months later, Marcus and Sarah's daughter was born, a beautiful baby girl they named Grace Lucinda Porter Chen. When I held her for the first time, via video call from my home in Cape Town, I saw in her tiny face the promise of a different kind of future, one where she would grow up knowing she was valued and respected, where her place at every table would be secure and honored. "She has your eyes," Sarah said softly, adjusting the camera so I could see Grace better. "She has her father's stubborn chin," I replied, laughing through my tears, "but I hope she has her mother's backbone." As I write this, Grace is now 2 years old, and I've made 4 trips to Seattle to spend time with her. Each visit is a joy, filled with the kind of grandmotherly activities I dreamed of. Reading stories, playing in the park, helping with bedtime routines. But more than that, each visit reinforces the new dynamic our family has built. I'm not a guest to be managed, or an obligation to be endured. I'm an integral part of Grace's life, someone whose presence is celebrated rather than tolerated. Last month, Sarah called with news that brought everything full circle. "Cindy, I have a proposition for you. Grace is going to start preschool next year, and I was wondering, would you consider moving to Seattle? Not permanently necessarily, but maybe spending part of each year here. We're thinking of buying a house with a small cottage in the backyard, and we'd love for you to have your own space here whenever you want it." The offer was both thrilling and terrifying. Moving to Seattle, even part-time, would mean leaving the small coastal town where I'd lived my entire adult life. But it would also mean being close to my son and daughter-in-law and granddaughter, being part of their daily lives rather than just a visitor. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Let me think about it." "Of course," Sarah said. "But Cindy, I want you to know that this isn't charity or obligation. We want you here because you make our lives better, because Grace adores you, because families are supposed to be together when they can be." As I consider Sarah's offer, I think about the journey that brought us to this point. 7 years ago, I was a woman who accepted poor treatment because I was afraid of losing my relationship with my son. Today, I'm a woman who knows her worth and refuses to settle for anything less than respect and dignity. The legal battle I fought wasn't just about accountability. It was about transformation. It transformed Marcus from someone who prioritized status over family into someone who understands what really matters. It transformed our relationship from one based on my unlimited tolerance for poor treatment into one based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Most importantly, it transformed me from someone who stayed quiet to keep the peace into someone who speaks up when necessary. Someone who knows that real love sometimes requires difficult conversations and hard boundaries. Whatever I decide about Sarah's offer, I know that my place in this family is secure now. Not because I'm tolerated or managed, but because I'm valued and cherished. Not because I stay quiet and accept whatever scraps of attention I'm given, but because I've proven that I deserve better, and I'm willing to fight for it. The woman who stepped off that plane in Seattle 7 years ago, so full of hope and excitement about her son's wedding, could never have imagined where that journey would lead. The humiliation she experienced was real and devastating, but it was also the beginning of something she couldn't have anticipated. A fight for dignity that would ultimately restore not just her own self-respect, but her family relationships as well. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the catalysts for the best changes in our lives. Sometimes losing everything we thought we wanted helps us discover what we actually need. And sometimes, the courage to stand up for ourselves transforms not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone around us. As I sit in my garden this morning, watching the South African sun rise over the ocean, and thinking about my granddaughter's laughter echoing through a Seattle backyard, I smile at the unexpected turns life can take. The invitation to Marcus's first wedding led to the worst humiliation of my life. The invitation to his second wedding led to the restoration of our relationship. And now, his invitation for me to become a more permanent part of their lives might lead to the next chapter of this ongoing story of family, forgiveness, and the power of refusing to accept anything less than we deserve. Whatever comes next, I'll face it with the same dignity and determination that carried me through the darkest days of this journey. Because I've learned something valuable from everything that happened. We teach people how to treat us by what we're willing to accept. And I'm no longer willing to accept anything less than love, respect, and a place of honor at every table where I belong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.